reasonable dispute. Capitalism as an ideology requires only a small government with limited powers. But such governments ended in the Great Depression. Before that time, the budget of the United States government would consume 3 or 4% of the gross domestic product. But after the Depression, it consumed between 18 and 24%, and sometimes as much as 42% of the GDP. This is not limited government. Why this growth of government? Everybody complains about it, but nobody asks why. Why has every regime, whether on the right or the left, whether American or European or Asian, whether liberal or conservative, every regime has adopted this big government strategy? I believe there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that big government is required for the concentration of capital. Government aids the concentration of capital in a variety of ways, which we will examine in a moment. However, this concentration of capital leads to a further problem, a chronic failure of demand. With stagnant wages, there is not enough purchasing power to clear the markets. The market then requires a big spender, and the only possible spender of that size is the government. This leads to the wonderful world of big budgets, big welfare, big projects, big armies, and an even bigger army of regulators and tax gatherers. And all of this happens when the system works well, which it frequently doesn't, since the very presence of so much money and so much power naturally tends to corruption and inefficiencies. The very presence of such big government works against the entrepreneur. In a truly free market system, competition is continually driving prices to costs. In a truly free market, it would be difficult to concentrate wealth because profits, like every other cost, would be marginalized. This, of course, is nothing but the theory behind competitive markets, a theory which works very well in practice. Indeed, it works too well. Too well, that is, if one is trying to concentrate capital. In order to do this, the free, competitive market must be circumscribed, fenced in with a wall of regulation and taxes. Now, these regulations raise great barriers to entrepreneurship, that is to say, to competition. They form a protective barrier for large businesses. After all, regulation forms only a small part of a big business, but a big part of a small business. A corporation can simply establish a department to deal with the bureaucrats, but an entrepreneur must give of his own time, a very scarce commodity indeed, and subtract that time from the time he can devote to his real business. Further, the corporations, in concentrating economic power, also concentrate political power. Hence, they are often able to greatly influence regulations to their own advantage and raise further barriers to competition from smaller enterprises. Hence, the regulations adopted with the best of intentions have the actual effect of protecting corporations from real competition. The accumulation of political power has another effect. Namely, the corporations can often shift the burden of taxation away from themselves and onto small businesses, to the individual taxpayer, or, as is the case in the United States, onto the next generation. In the United States, the budget deficit the debt exceeds $12 trillion and is rising at the rate this year of $1.4 trillion, with nothing but rivers of red ink projected for decades to come. My children, my grandchildren, will not be able to pay that debt. And there is a further problem. The large corporation concentrates political power and hence is in a position to obtain large subsidies and other privileges from the state. Further still, it can externalize many of its costs in a way not available to small businesses. In reality, the large corporation is not so much economically efficient as politically efficient. The situation the world over is that the large corporation is colonizing more and more of the spaces that were once available to the small businessmen. And this is true whether it's in retail, in manufacturing, in services, or whatever. Hence, little space is left for the entrepreneur. And the business student has, in practice, only the option of becoming not a real businessman or businesswoman, but a lifelong bureaucrat. At this point, we must ask whether there is any real alternative to such a system. And when dealing with any alternative, we must ask two questions. The first is whether the system is merely utopian. And the second is whether such a system may actually be implemented in a modern society, such as Romania. As to the first question, I must comment that I despise utopian systems, by which I mean systems which, however good they might look in theory, have no actual practice behind them. It is far too easy to invent abstract systems. Much harder to make them work in practice. And practice alone should be our standard as practical men and women. The fact is that both capitalism and communism share this abstract nature, with no actual practice behind them. They are both purely idealistic. Of course, it is well known that there has never been, in all human history, a successful example of communism. And attempts to implement this idealistic system have always been less than ideal, to say the least. However, what is less well understood is that there have never been, in all of human history, a successful example of laissez-faire capitalism. The libertarian system, for all its theoretical virtues,